Good evening. Oh, like that. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement here at the Pratt Library. Thanks for coming out for our last program of the summer. I know it is only July 20th, but Sophia and JP and I are going to take a break, and we're going to be back on September 7th. We're still going to have to work, but we won't be doing programs. Right? Yes. There's a lot of great stuff coming up this fall. It's all on our website. So go to the Pratt Library's website, go to the Writers Live listing, click there, and you'll see everything we have coming up in September, October, and in November. So also, before we get started, Kevin's going to talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll have time for your questions. He also has books up here. So after the program is over, please come up, buy a book, have Kevin sign it. He'd be happy to do so. And then finally, if anyone parked in the Franklin Street garage, we provide validated parking. So for now, or if you come to a future program, it's $5 to park there, but it's free when you come to one of our programs. You just come see us, myself or Sophia, we'll give you a validated parking ticket. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome award-winning journalist Kevin Naff to the Pratt Library to discuss his new book, How We Won the War for LGBTQ Equality, and How Our Enemies Could Take It All Away. In it, he reflects on the past 20 years of the LGBTQ rights movement. The co-owner and editor of the Washington Blade, the nation's oldest LGBTQ newspaper, Mr. Naff offers his insights into the progress that has been made, as well as the current threats to overturn the movement's hard-fought gains. As just mentioned, Kevin Naff is a co-owner and editor of the Washington Blade, as well as a co-founder and owner of Brown Naff Pitts Omni Media, which publishes the Los Angeles Blade. Radio host and author Michelangelo Signorelli called the book a sharp, incisive look at the powerful ways activism can change the world, as well as the ways that progress can quickly be rolled back. Read this book and take it as another reminder of how fragile equal rights are and how victorious we can be when we wake from complacency and organize fiercely. In GLAAD, President and CEO Sarah Kate Ellis commented, "For decades, Kevin Naff has been a trusted leader at the forefront of LGBTQ equality, who leads best-in-class journalism and coverage of LGBTQ people and issues." This book reflects his fierce commitment to excellence and integrity in shaping and reporting on LGBTQ issues. With his unique insights and perspectives, Naff has created a comprehensive and necessary record of the recent history and successes of the LGBTQ community. It is my great pleasure to welcome Kevin Naff to the Pratt Library.
Thanks, Cleve. Thank all of you for being here. Thanks to Sophia and my dear cousin Neil Naff for having me here tonight. It's an honor to be here at this important community institution. I do want to take a second and establish my Baltimore cred. We should just acknowledge that the Orioles are in first place in July for the first time since 2016. I have actually lived in Baltimore for, 25 years or something now, a long time. I have done the commute to DC for the better part of that time, at least pre-COVID. I don't recommend it. I came here from New York to start the website for the Baltimore Sun in 1996. I've served on the board of Live Baltimore and otherwise been a part of the community for a very long time here. So that is my my Baltimore story and cred for you all. So as Cleve said, I've been the editor of The Blade for 20 years. The Blade is the nation's oldest LGBTQ news outlet, founded right after Stonewall. The format tonight, I've done a bunch of these events now since March, and normally what I do is I have a local journalist interview me. And instead, I'm going to interview myself. What I've done is kind of gone through those events and pulled like the 10 or so questions that are most common or generate the most kind of feedback and interest. So I'm going to kind of run through those, which will give us an overview of the book, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So first, I think I should explain the title. I know it rolls right off the tongue. It was not my first choice for a title. My title was Ranting Toward Equality. I thought that was cute and concise, but everyone hated it. The editors, the publicist, everybody said it was too angry. It needed to be more explanatory. So this was what we came up with. And I want to just explain it because there was a little bit of a social media kerfluffle about when it first came out. No, I'm not saying that the war has been won. What that refers to is the first part of the title is how we won the war for LGBTQ equality. And what that refers to is 20 years ago when I started, the movement had established sort of four main pillar goals. One was to get included in the federal hate crimes law. So sexual orientation and gender identity were not part of that law, even though we are disproportionately impacted by hate crimes. Second was to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which destroyed the careers of 15,000 service members and was signed by President Clinton. Third was employment protections, so protection from job discrimination. And fourth was some form of relationship recognition. Nobody was really talking about marriage. It was really about civil unions or civil partnerships. So those were the four goals. And if you evaluate the movement based on how we did on those goals, it's a solid A, right? We got first was the hate crimes law under President Obama. We then overturned Don't Ask, Don't Tell with the help of Republicans. That was a very interesting, protracted fight that went down to the wire. And there's a chapter on that in the book. But it's a very interesting fight. It was not the Democrats led us to victory by any measure. We did not get on employment protections. We did not get the Equality Act done. It was actually just reintroduced a couple of weeks ago. It's not going to go anywhere with McCarthy running the House, of course. But that bill's been kicking around since literally 1974. Bella Abzug introduced a much more expansive version of that bill in 1974, and we still don't have it done. But what we did get instead of the Equality Act is a Supreme Court ruling in the Bostock case, which extends employment protections under existing federal law to the vast majority of LGBTQ employees. So there are holes in that ruling. It does not apply to small businesses with fewer than 15 workers. It doesn't apply to religious institutions, and it doesn't cover like credit and public accommodations. But the vast majority of LGBTQ workers in America are covered under that Supreme Court ruling. So we do have most Americans covered from employment discrimination. And then, of course, we won marriage equality in all 50 states, which nobody saw coming, least of all me 20 years ago. So if you evaluate the movement based on those goals that it set out for itself, it's a solid A, and that's what the first half of the title refers to. The second half of the title, and how our enemies could take it all away, I had a kind of a sinking sense a couple years ago when I started to put the book together that we were headed for like a major backlash. I didn't realize how bad it was going to get, how quickly, but it was clear that the right wing is emboldened with this activist Supreme Court, the 6-3 supermajority. They've already undone Roe and affirmative action, and they've issued a disastrous ruling in the 303 creative case, which has already led other small business owners to discriminate against our community. And make no mistake that they are coming for the marriage ruling. Alito and Thomas have both publicly stated their desire to, quote, revisit the Obergefell marriage ruling. So that will likely go down, and they're going to come for that probably next. And so that's the second half of the title. What we've seen this year is more than 600 bills in state legislatures attacking LGBTQ rights. And what's especially sickening about that is, remember what happened in November? We had a mass shooting at a gay nightclub in Colorado Springs. 5 queer people were killed. And the response from our political leaders was not to pass gun reform, was not to strengthen laws against LGBTQ discrimination. It was to restrict our rights. It was to attack the trans community and even drag queens. And I don't know if y'all know any drag queens personally, but I do. And like literally the last people I would pick a fight with is drag queens. So I don't think this fight is going to end well for these Republicans who are going after drag queens. It is clearly constitutionally protected speech. So anywho, that's the the title. So the book is a compilation of the kind of the most important issues and essays and things that I've written and we've covered for 20 years. And then each essay is updated with some, contemporary commentary and stories that maybe I couldn't tell back then, insider things and behind the scenes stories and a little bit of gossip. And there's actually quite a bit of tea that is spilled in this book. There's a chapter on pop culture. I had put that chapter at the very end of the book, and everybody involved in the editing and the publicizing of the book said, we got to move that up. We got to lighten the mood and hook people early with the gossip and the celebrity stuff. So the pop culture chapter is now chapter 2. And we can talk a little bit more about the celebrity stuff because I know we all want to dish a little bit. So that's kind of the structure of the book and an explanation for the title. As far as the why now, I get that a lot. Like, why this book? Why now? Again, the impetus for it was really to commemorate the milestone of 20 years editing the Blade and the remarkable progress that the movement achieved in such a short period of time. But secondly, it was to kind of raise the alarm that we are facing some incredible opposition and backlash now. And when I say backlash, I don't mean like knee-jerk backlash. I mean like really well-funded, deep-pocketed right-wing enemies who are hell-bent on rolling all of this back. So that's what we're up against. It is in full swing. And I had yet another reminder of it just this morning. I had to go to DC for a meeting with the DC police because our staff received a death threat. These MAGA people, it's the volume is turned way up now, and like my staff and I are pretty used to getting hate mail and anti-gay slurs and all of that. That comes with the territory, but the number of threats that have started to come in is really alarming, and I think it's only going to get worse as we approach the election next year. So things have really changed, and this is part of Donald Trump's legacy. He has validated all of the horrible views of these ignorant people, and they now feel emboldened to express not just hate, but violent hate speech out loud. So I was in DC meeting with the police who want to shore up security around our office because of the threats. So again, that's the why now. We're in full backlash mode, and we need to fight back. And my big hope for the book is that younger generations can look to it as a template for how my generation chose to fight back. So, here were the lawsuits that we filed. Here were the tactics we used to pressure Congress, to pressure, Hollywood even to include us, because we cover a wide range of societal change at the Blade, not just politics, but pop culture, Hollywood, sports, religion, any sort of facet of American life where we need queer visibility and acceptance. So summing up the progress that we've made, I kind of went over that in the explanation for the title, but the very first essay in the book, young people, this crowd, I know you might remember the Lawrence, Texas ruling. I'm going to recap it because it really is an incredible thing. But young people are shocked. I've been to a bunch of college campuses, and I tell the story of the Lawrence ruling because they had no idea that literally 20 years ago, it was illegal in many places for us to have sex. So the Lawrence, Texas case was about a consensual gay male couple in Texas who went home to their private home, shut the door, locked the door, went to their bedroom, and did what couples do and had sex. An ex-boyfriend of one of the guys decided to mess with them, and he called the police, and he filed a false police report that there was an armed intruder in the house. So the police show up thinking there's a burglar. They break into the house, they barge into the bedroom, and they find this couple in bed, and they arrest them under the Texas sodomy law, because technically it was illegal for us to have sex in many places. And And don't think we're off the hook because we're in blue Maryland, because Maryland just repealed our sodomy law this session. Governor Moore just, I don't think he signed it. I think it became law without his signature, but they just got that done literally this year. We had a sodomy law here in Maryland. Um, and the reason legislatures like Maryland are working to overturn those old antiquated laws that are unconstitutional, thanks to the Lawrence ruling, is because there is real fear that the Lawrence ruling could go down under this right-wing court. And so states need to be working now to get those old laws off the books before the Lawrence decision goes down and those old laws come back into effect. So anyway, so this couple gets arrested. They file a lawsuit. It takes another 5 years before it's finally resolved in 2003. And it's the first essay in the book. And I start with that because it really was the turning point. It really was um, the the uh, the ruling that established that, hey, we're no longer illegal. And those sodomy laws were used to deny us security clearances, to deny us jobs, and they were, odious, horrible laws. And so that was a momentous decision that really sort of ignited all of the progress that was to come in the next 20 years. And uh, you can't understate it. And there was in researching the book, I went back over the decision, and Antonin Scalia, uh, who I agree with on about just about nothing, wrote a very prescient dissent in that case, in which he predicted that the Lawrence decision would one day lead to gay marriage, and he was, I'm happy to say, absolutely correct about that. So that was just 20 years ago, folks. That in many states in this country, gay people couldn't have sex in their own private home. We didn't have a constitutional right to privacy. So when you sum up how far we've come in 20 years, that's where we started. And at the time, we had a president, George W. Bush, who ran his reelection campaign on the backs of our relationships. He very cynically put ballot measures banning gay marriage on 11 states. That whole campaign was run by Baltimore's very own Ken Mellman, closet case extraordinaire, the modern Roy Cohn, who was the head of the RNC. He was the head of the Bush-Cheney reelection campaign. And he orchestrated this campaign, and it worked. All 11 of those ballot measures in swing states, they all passed, and Bush was reelected. And that was just, again, 20 years ago. If you fast forward 20 years, uh, we've had a Supreme Court ruling in favor of marriage equality, of course, and we have a president now in Joe Biden who has described transgender rights as the civil rights issue of our time. So that's pretty remarkable lightning speed to travel. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge how far we've come and remember it. And when I talk to young people, they can't believe that 20 years ago we weren't allowed to have sex at home. Um, but I tell them they don't want you to know. That's why you don't know. It's by design that you don't know. Not only are we not part of history classes, our history is not told, but it's now being banned. Not just the teaching of it, but the mentioning of it in Florida and elsewhere. That Florida, when you look at that Florida law, which is just, I mean, that DeSantis ripped that right out of Putin's playbook. I mean, Putin had a very similar law that he put into effect a few years ago. In Florida today, well, possibly this event would not be possible, but you literally could have a situation where you had, because that law was expanded from third grade through 12th grade. So you could literally have a situation where you have an 18-year-old high school senior who's a legal adult who is not allowed to learn that Pete Buttigieg is the first openly gay Senate confirmed cabinet member. Like, you couldn't teach that in history or social studies because you'd be mentioning gay. It's outrageous. We've written stories, we've interviewed teachers in Florida public schools who are gay, who have had to take down photos of their spouse from their desk because that is technically a violation of the law. And this is happening right now in, in 2023 America. It's really draconian and quite scary. Um, but again, we've come a long way in 20 years. So that's where we started, the Lawrence decision, and and again, it's important, I think, to remember what that case was about, and to make sure that especially younger folks understand what's at stake. Because, like I said, I do think the Obergefell ruling is in jeopardy, and I think if they undo that, I don't think they'll stop there. I think Lawrence um, is potentially next. Um, anywho, uh, scary times. But let's talk about something happier. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, um, what person or event in our march toward equality was the most significant? And certainly there've been a lot, but I would say, without hesitation, that Barack Obama is the most significant figure. And he would probably dispute that. Um, and in fact, in the last press conference of his administration, he called on the blade for the third to final question of his presidency. And we asked him what role or what impact LGBTQ rights would have on his legacy. And he said, in sort of typical Obama, modesty, that he declined to take credit for all of the progress that had happened under his watch. And he gave the credit to all of the LGBTQ people who had come out publicly over 50 years. And he said, um, the legislative wins and the court victories, those are great, but he said those would have been impossible without all these openly LGBTQ people living their lives authentically and openly. So that was how he summed up the progress that occurred under his watch. But I think it's important to remember just how significant a figure he was, because up until Obama, the candidates for president, the candidates that rose to the top of the Democratic Party were of the party system. So they were beholden to the DNC, they were beholden to all the wealthy donors, and they would talk often a big game behind closed doors and then deliver us nothing once the cameras were on them. But Obama was different. Uh, he came out of nowhere. He was not of the party system. He didn't owe anybody anything, and he was free to do things in new, bold ways. And so, one of the first things he did for our community, the LGBTQ community, in 2009 in June, he hosted the first ever White House Pride reception, and it was a fairly intimate group. I'd say about 200 people, and I was invited, which was exciting. Uh, we and I remember standing outside the White House waiting to go in, and nobody really knew how to act because none of us had ever been invited inside before. Many of those people had been arrested at the White House, had chained themselves to the fence, but we had never been invited inside for tea. So, there was some nerves and trepidation, but we we walk in, and I can hear Madonna playing, and I'm walking through the White House, and I hear Vogue, and I hear like Lady Gaga. I'm like, and I'm having like a weird out of body, surreal moment. And I get up to the East Room, and there are bars set up around the perimeter of the room, and the signature drink was a Cosmo, which are pink, little pink cocktails. So all these people are milling around with pink cocktails, listening to Madonna and Lady Gaga in the White House. So it was like, wow, okay, things have really changed. Wasn't expecting this. And so we go in, and the president comes out, and Michelle was by his side. And I will never forget the first few words that he said to us. He said, "Welcome to your house." That's how he opened his speech. And I mean, there wasn't a dry eye. Like, everybody was in tears. And you could have heard a pin drop because, again, none of us in that room ever looked at the White House as ours. It was other. It was somebody else's house. It was somewhere to protest. It wasn't ours. And so, and the fact that these words were being uttered by the America's first Black president. I mean, it was just a powerful, powerful moment. And I think we all knew that we were on the cusp of something really big. Like this was momentous change. So, so I would say that President Obama is the most significant, influential figure that our movement has known in the last 20 years, easily. The next question on the list is what has been the hardest topic to cover? And certainly there've been a lot of those. George W. Bush's reelection was not a good night. You know, the Trump years were challenging to say the least. But I think the single hardest um, event that I've covered in 20 years at the Blade was the Pulse massacre. It occurred during Pride weekend in DC. I had spent the night, we got in a hotel room because we had Pride events all weekend and I had to be up early Sunday morning, and my phone's blowing up with texts and I'm trying to ignore it and go to sleep, and finally pick up the phone and it's, you know, check CNN, check CNN. So I put on CNN and they've got the first reports out and it was, you know, 10 dead, 12 dead, 20 dead. And so when I hit like 25, I knew this was, you know, going to be a major story for our community. So I had a reporter get on the plane and get down there right away. And within a few hours, the death toll had gone to 49, which at the time was the worst mass shooting in American history and in one of our nightclubs. So then I got on the plane and went down there. And I remember getting there and thinking, you know, the mainstream reporters, they all went to the club, which of course you can't get anywhere near. It's all roped off, you know, the police, and they're all standing 2 blocks away, setting up backdrops of the Pulse sign for their live shots. I went to the LGBT community center in Orlando instead of going to the club. And when I got there, I was expecting to find people crying and doors locked and heavy security. And what I found was the doors were open, and people were running around busy and working. And the director of the center gave me a quick tour, and I asked him, you know, what are all these people doing? And he said, well, we're working. He said, a lot of these victims, uh, they're from other countries, they're from the Caribbean, their families don't have money, so we're negotiating with the airlines to get free plane tickets for relatives so they can come and visit their loved ones in the hospital or bury their loved ones. And we're working with you know, the embassies to expedite visas, and they were doing all this work. And I got to the back of the room, and there was stacked to the ceiling all these pallets of water, bottled water. And I said, "What's all this water for?" And he said, "Well, after the shooting, the area hospitals in Orlando put out an urgent call for blood donations. And of course, gay people can't give blood, and so the straight community stepped up, and people were standing in 100-degree heat in 1,500 people deep lines to give blood. And so the LGBT community center was driving around to all these blood donation places, making sure that everybody in line had water, it was hydrated, had snacks, so that people would stay and wait it out and give the blood that was so desperately needed. Um, and so that was how our community reacted and how we tend to react to tragedy. Unfortunately, we have a lot of experience with that. Um, and one of the, I don't know if I can call it a highlight of the trip, but I was at I stopped by a memorial, kind of an impromptu memorial site to the victims. And just as I got there, a limo pulled up, and Florida Governor Rick Scott steps out. Well, he had not, to that point, he was doing this weird thing where he was refusing to acknowledge that the victims were LGBTQ. So he wouldn't say anything to the community, uh, you know, which the community was scared, right? When we were targeted and people were afraid. And he wouldn't even acknowledge that the victims were queer. And so he got up and did this little impromptu news conference. And he took like 2 softball questions from the local TVs and then walked off. And I hit the roof and I grabbed his communications person and I said, look, I'm the only one here from the LGBTQ media. Our community was the target. He owes us an answer. He owes me a question, and I'm not leaving until I get it. So she said, all right, meet me at the car and I'll get you in front of him. So I go to the car, and here comes the governor. He's now senator, and he gets there, and I said to him, Governor, I said, you have not acknowledged the basic fact that this was an attack on the LGBTQ community. What is your message to your gay constituents, your trans constituents, who were the targets of this attack? And will you acknowledge that we were the targets? And he kind of did this and stepped back from me. And I don't think anybody had spoken to him like that. And then he burst into tears. And I thought, okay, I made the governor cry. So good for me. And then he pulled himself together and gave me a quote. But I thought, this guy's crying at a question. And I just came from the community center where the folks there knew the victims. They should have been crying, but they were busy getting all the work done. So it was just a reminder, I think, of how resilient and strong our community is and how accustomed we are to getting down to work when tragedy strikes. So I would say that was the toughest issue to cover. So do you want to talk a little celebrity trash? So there is a pop culture chapter, as I said, and the question I get is, what famous person was the most fun and least fun to work with over the years at the Blade? So I've and all of these stories are in the book, and so I would say my two favorite. I go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner every year, and I always invite like celebrity guests to come with me. And I would say the two most fun have been Judith Light. We all know Judith, right? Icon. Tremendous ally. I took her right after COVID when they still had COVID restrictions, and she was hilarious. I had to meet her early because there were all these requirements that you had to have a negative COVID test. You had to upload it to an app, a special app for the dinner. And her publicist called me and she's like, Kevin, there's no way Judith is going to be able to figure this out. She's not going to be able to upload to an app or any of that. So I said, all right, I'll meet her early and I'll do that for her. So I find her in the lobby of the Hilton, the Washington Hilton, which is a huge hotel and full of people. And she says, oh, well, I thought they were sending somebody to administer my COVID test. And I said, yeah, that's me. Where do you want to go? And I said, do you want to go to your room or somewhere private? She's like, no, let's just go over here. So we're sitting in the middle of the Hilton with all these people going by, and I'm administering Judith's COVID test. So we do that, and we figure all that out. And then, later that night, we had our date, and she's hilarious. She is a lot of fun. She just cracked me up all night. And at the end of the night, though, I walked her back to the elevator to go back to her room, and she said, "Oh, Kevin, would you mind taking off my necklace? I'll never be able to get this necklace off." And I said, "Yeah, sure." So I go around and I, undo the latch, the hook, and I take the necklace off. And then she's like, "Hey, while you're back there, would you unhook my skirt?" And again, we're in the lobby of the Hilton with hundreds of people everywhere, and she's in this fancy gown. And I'm like, well, I could try. And I said, this might come as a surprise, but I've never done this before. So I'm back there like reaching around in her dress, and anyway, finally undid her skirt, and we parted ways. But she's a riot. The other, I would say, probably the most memorable of those celebrity dates, though, was Laverne Cox. We all know Laverne. So I invited her a few years ago, and we had an interesting night. The night before the dinner, just by coincidence, was the big Caitlyn Jenner coming out as trans interview. That was the Diane Sawyer interview that everybody watched, and it was a huge, of course, story. And so we get to the event, and it's all paparazzi and cameras and CNN and all of that, and everybody wants to talk to Laverne. They all want to know her thoughts on Caitlyn. So So we start going down the gauntlet, and the first reporter, then the next reporter, then the CNN reporter, and finally she turns to me and she says, "Kevin, if one more person asks me about fucking Caitlyn Jenner, I'm gonna lose it. Get me out of here." Like, all right, come on, Laverne. So I take her, we go through security, and she's all, full glam, like glam squad, the gown, the borrowed diamond, gigantic diamond bracelet, the whole thing. And we get inside, and she bumps into Katie Couric, who she apparently knows. And so the three of us are chatting, and then Katie Couric says, "Oh, I want to introduce you guys to my date." And she taps this guy on the shoulder, kind of a bigger, older guy, and he turns around, and it's Antonin Scalia. So now I'm standing in a tight circle with Laverne Cox, Katie Couric, and Antonin Scalia. And this is April, and we all know the marriage ruling is coming in June. And here, Laverne and I are in front of Antonin Scalia. So we're both freaking out, thinking like, we got to come up with something, to change his mind on marriage. And I think we talked about the weather or something, and moved on, but we totally choked. So anyway, we finish up, we go inside, we sit down, the lights go down, the program's about to start, and Laverne turns to me and says, "Kevin, the fucking bracelet is gone." So the giant diamond bracelet that we've been talking about all night is gone. So I am like on all fours under the table with my iPhone flashlight, trying to find this bracelet. And I went and got security, and I alerted security, and I come back, and she's in full panic, and she's texting her stylist. And I said, "Laverne, how much is that bracelet?" She's like, "It's $100,000. And they're going to think I stole it." And so anyway, it kind of cast a pall over the night. So the program ends, and we go back to security. No bracelet. So that was awkward. And I was like, "Well, Laverne, nice to meet you. Sorry." And I leave. So about 4 in the morning, my phone rings, and it's Laverne. She's like, "Kevin, I found the bracelet. It was in the bottom of my purse the whole time." So crisis averted. But she's hilarious, and we had a ball. Um, Now for the trash talk. The worst celebrity that I have ever had to deal with, and there have been many, but the absolute worst is Kathy Griffin. She's crazy. There's something wrong with this woman. She, I brought her as my date only because it was during the Trump years, and no celebrity would go near the event. And it was really boring for 4 years. No celebrity would touch it, but I knew she would do it. And it was right after she had done that stunt where she posed with the severed Trump head and was canceled everywhere. So I invited her, and she of course accepted. And almost immediately, all the diva demands, started up. She needs another ticket. She needs this and that hotel, and the car service, and whatever. She had a whole laundry list of things. So we get to the venue, and we're sitting there, and she sees one of the deputy White House press secretaries is headed our way, and he was holding a beer, a Tecate beer, which is a Mexican beer, and he walks by our table, and she looks at him and goes, "How do you sleep at night working for this administration?" And keep in mind, this is a black tie event. She is a guest, and he's like, "I sleep just fine, thank you. If you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go drink this beer before we build the wall, and you can't get them anymore." And I was like, "Uh-oh." And then like Kathy's head popped off, and she starts effing the guy out, and it just like devolved into finger pointing and name calling and cursing. And I'm just like under the table because I'm like, all right, she's gonna fly out back to LA tomorrow, and I'm the one that's stuck having to deal with these people. So he finally leaves. Then at the next table, she spots Sean Spicer, who had been the press secretary, and starts the same thing, like starts yelling at him, and all the people around us are staring, and then everyone's looking at me like, "Why did you bring this woman here?" And anyway, it was horrible and very embarrassing. And then what made it even worse, I had asked her, all I ask in return for this is that when you do press, you say, I'm here at the invitation of the Washington Blade, the nation's oldest LGBTQ newspaper. Pretty easy. She never said it. She was on The View the next day. She was on Jimmy Kimmel the next day. She did this whole press tour around the White House and never thanked us or acknowledged the Blade. So she is on my permanent list. Anyway, all of those and more are in the pop culture chapter of the book. Well, let's talk about, since we're in Maryland, I feel like we should talk about Martin O'Malley and Maryland. So there's a chapter in the book called Duplicitous Allies. And it's a lot of, a bunch of essays about the Democratic Party and how they used and abused us in the early and mid 2000s. And what I came to learn was that the party then, and Howard Dean was in charge, and Howard and I had a very public falling out. He called me the Fox News of gay journalism, and I called him the Gomer Pyle of politicians, which I thought was pretty good. But what I figured out was that the Democratic Party back then, they didn't care about us. What they cared about was there were a lot of wealthy gay donors who wrote checks every month, and they knew who they were and they knew how much to expect, and they tracked every penny, and that's what they cared about. We weren't big enough voting bloc for them to like go out on a limb for our equality, but they wanted to keep that money rolling in. So Howard Dean hired a chief of staff who was a Pentecostal minister. It was one of those churches where they speak in tongues. She did a lot of shady things in terms of undermining the gay delegates. They fired the LGBT liaison. There was a lot of stuff going on, and we were writing a lot of tough stories, and I was writing a lot of really tough op-eds and opinion pieces, which are in the book. And things just kind of started to go south with the Democratic Party and the Blade. I had a private meeting with Howard Dean, which I thought went okay, and then this lawsuit, the guy that was fired, the LGBT liaison that Dean fired, filed a lawsuit for retaliation. And in the course of discovery for that lawsuit, he had subpoenaed a bunch of emails, which were then leaked to us. And so there were all these emails that we were going through where the Blade was, just derided, and, I don't know, one of the senior people said that, she lines her birdcage with the Blade and whatever, all of these kind of insults directed at us. So things just kind of deteriorated. And I'm in the office one day, and somebody comes to get me and says, there are two lawyers here to see you and our publisher. So I go out, and these two guys in suits and ties, and they represented themselves as attorneys for the DNC. So we go into a conference room with my publisher, and they proceed to scream at us, effing us out, threatening to sue us personally, threatening to sue the Blade over all of our critical coverage, none of which they disputed, by the way. It was all factual stuff. And they were literally red-faced, like screaming at us. So when they finished, my publisher showed them the door and then turned to me and said, well, I think you're onto something. I'd write about this meeting if I were you. I was like, yeah, I think we will write about this. So I wrote about the meeting and published their names and the threats that they had made against us, which kind of made things worse with the DNC. And I got a call from Andy Tobias, was at the time the treasurer of the Democratic Party. He happened to be gay. And he reached out to me and said, can we have lunch? I want to have an off the record meeting. And I said, sure. So I meet him for lunch. And after we exchanged pleasantries, it comes out that he knows where all the gay money comes from, and they have detected a major drop in donations from their gay donors, and they are attributing all of that to the coverage in the Blade and my op-eds. Would you please stop? So, needless to say, we didn't stop, and that whole crew, didn't last much longer. And it really wasn't until Obama came and ushered all of those people out and replaced them with much more competent people that things improved. But there's a whole chapter in the book on these duplicitous allies, and I want to bring it back to Martin O'Malley. And I know that there are probably friends of his in the room, so I will be as diplomatic as I can be. Martin was one of those Democrats. Okay, so he was one of the ones who privately to gay audiences, gay plaintiffs, gay donors, talked about his support for marriage equality. He even was caught on, I think it was Channel 11, years earlier, years before it was really even a big issue, saying he supported marriage rights for same-sex couples. Of course, he ended up trying to deny that, but anyway, it all kind of blew up in his face after the Court of Appeals ruling. I think it was 2007 when they ruled against marriage in Maryland, and it was a devastating ruling. And I remember being right here in Mount Vernon, down on the corner, the Unitarian Church. There was a big rally, and I was covering it for the Blade, and people were devastated. I mean, couples were crying, couples that had planned their weddings. Everyone just thought, we're in Maryland, it's a blue state, we're going to get marriage, and we didn't. And so people were canceling weddings. And while we were standing there, Martin O'Malley, the governor at the time, issued a statement saying that he respects the court's decision and nobody should be messing with the sacraments anyway. Well, you could imagine that didn't go over so well. So after that statement came out, I started getting calls from very wealthy gay donors who said, okay, we're done with Martin O'Malley, and started giving me a bunch of information about the things he was saying to them behind closed doors. So we started writing some stories. I was writing some tough op-eds, which are in the book, about O'Malley and his duplicity. And I get a call from O'Malley's communications guy who says, the governor has read your op-eds and he's very upset and he wants to meet with you in Annapolis. And I said, okay. And I said, I will come to Annapolis on one condition, that it's on the record and I can bring my tape recorder, because y'all have had enough off the record, behind closed door meetings with, activists that have gotten us absolutely nowhere. So they reluctantly agreed, and I went to Annapolis and I sat down with Martin. And so it was an awkward interview because Martin O'Malley, if you've ever met him, or, when I was interviewing him, he comes across as someone who wants to be Clintonian, but he's not quite smart enough. You sort of see those thought bubbles, those cartoons with the thought bubbles and like the wheels turning. You ask a question and then they're like long, awkward pauses, and you can tell he's trying to think of like the least offensive, most poll-tested thing that I could possibly say. And so we had this really lame interview where he basically said nothing. And earlier that day, just coincidentally, Mark Fisher, who was an editor at the Washington Post, had published a column about O'Malley, and he was saying, this used to be a thing that politicians would do, where they would refuse to say the word gay in public. And so George W. Bush, I remember we did a big article in the Blade once. Bush has not uttered the word gay in public in 18 months or whatever. And so O'Malley was doing the same thing. He would talk around issues, and people would ask him questions, and he would just sort of trip over himself to not say the word gay. So Mark Fisher picks up on this and does this column in the Washington Post the morning of my interview. So I said to Martin, one last question, Martin. I said, the Washington Post thinks you can't say the word gay. It was it was, it was tongue in cheek. The answer to the question is gay. That's all he had. That's all I was looking for. And he does the whole thing again with the pausing and the turning of the wheels. And I'm sitting there like, really? And then he comes out with this whole word salad about, oh, the DC media establishment, they just have never understood me and blah, blah, blah. And I said, Martin, can you say it? And he looks at me and he goes, like deer in the headlights, gay. So that's all I'm looking for. It's not a gotcha moment. Anyway, ultimately, he did come around after a lot of pressure. And he was supportive and he did lead the charge on the ballot initiative. And Maryland became the first state to beat back a ballot initiative that year. I think that was the year Obama was elected or reelected. Who remembers? I should remember this. It was a big night, right? Election night, and Maryland becomes the first state in the country to beat back a marriage marriage ban at the ballot. So he came around. He put his full weight of his administration behind that, behind beating that. So I gave him credit for that. And then we made up at the bill signing, and he gave me one of the pens that he used to sign it. So I think we're cool, but we definitely had a rough road. So there's a whole chapter in the book about these duplicitous allies. I think we need to move to audience questions. Let me just, I want to just very quickly, I'm going to race through a couple of quick things. I think we would be remiss standing in Baltimore City to not talk about race. So there is not a chapter in the book on race, because race, as we know, I think most of us know, touches everything. So there was a racial component to the marriage equality fight, which is in the book. And just very briefly, we talk about intersectionality, but I don't think people always understand what that means. And so for us, intersectionality, the best example of it that I've seen in 20 years came during the marriage fight. So the first commercials that were made around the marriage equality movement usually featured white gay couples or white lesbian couples complaining that they didn't have equal rights. Those ads did not move the needle. What happened and I think it started in DC and then Maryland copied it, and then it was copied elsewhere, but started to feature Black pastors in marriage equality ads talking about why marriage equality was a civil rights issue. And those ads moved the needle because people in faith communities, people in communities of color, they sat up and went, why are the Black pastors talking about gay marriage? It really sparked conversation among communities that weren't necessarily supportive before. So when we talk about intersectionality, that's what it looks like in practice. And then what happened after that is we saw immigration rights groups stood with us, labor unions stood with us. So I always remind my white audiences that it is important to repay all of that, because we would not have gotten this far without the support of a lot of other underrepresented communities. And there's an essay in the book about Freddie Gray, because those of us who live in the city and lived through that tough experience, I think we were all touched by it and affected by it in some way. So there's an essay in there reflecting on that and my experiences with that story. And it never fails when we cover a story like a Freddie Gray or a George Floyd. I get emails from white readers who say, "Well, why is the Blade covering this? George Floyd's not gay. Freddie Gray wasn't gay. Why is the Blade writing about this?" And I remind them that our community uniquely intersects with every other, right? So there are LGBTQ people who are Black, who are Jewish, who are brown, who are any other identity. So violence against Black people is violence against LGBTQ people. And that's the reason we cover it. So so I just thought I wanted to make sure we addressed some of that. I won't go into the whole Freddie Gray thing because it is in the book, but it is a pretty powerful essay about the days that followed and what the city went through. Those of us who were here and lived through the curfew and all of the the National Guard and all of that. So that's in the book. And very quickly, um, I like to end on a positive note because I know there's a lot of scary stuff going on in the world these days. Um, but I have been really buoyed by the reaction from young folks as I've been on this book tour since March. And when you look at the voting patterns and the engagement of Gen Z, they're stronger than millennials. They are politically engaged and solutions oriented in ways that previous generations have not been. And the thing that unites them is the mass shootings. And no matter how they identify, left, right, middle, whatever, um, they have grown up with these mass shootings, and it has united them in a very powerful and unique way. And I think if the Republicans don't come up with messaging other than thoughts and prayers, they are doomed with that generation because they're not going to settle for thoughts and prayers. So I do feel optimistic that generation is going to get it and is going to pick up the mantle and they're going to vote and they're going to work to undo some of the damage that's coming and that's been done. So I do think there's good news, and I think the silver lining about the Supreme Court, as bad as that is, the silver lining is that I think our movement relied too heavily on the courts for our victories for too long. And so now it's forcing us to go and fight in the states. And that's what we should have been doing all along. And so now we're doing that. And I think that is where the change will come in the next 5 to 10 years as we fight back at the state level. So, and the courts are already ruling in our favor on a lot of these crazy laws. So the drag bans are being thrown out. A lot of these anti-trans healthcare bills are being thrown out as unconstitutional. So, so there is good news, and I do ultimately think that love wins and our community wins. So, on that note, I will turn it to you. Yes. Sure. Well, well, first of all, Obama never lied to us. O'Malley lied. So O'Malley said, to rich donors behind closed doors that yeah, of course I support marriage equality, and then publicly said something totally different. So that's number one. But number two is that Obama was always very upfront about it. I mean, he was very honest about, that he was a little bit old school, but he always said the same thing, which was, keep pushing me. He said, keep pushing me. I'm evolving. I'm not there yet, but keep fighting me, keep pushing me, keep going. And we did. And he got there. And to his great credit, he came out publicly for marriage equality in, I think it was May, and the election, was in November against Romney. And the so-called queer activists, really lobbyists, were telling the campaign, don't do it, don't come out for marriage, wait till after the election, we don't want to risk losing because of this. And to his great credit, he said, no, I'm gonna, and whether Biden intended to do that or whether it was one of his, gaffe moments, we'll never, I guess, really know. But of course, Biden beat him to the punch, and then Obama came out. Now, of course, I took issue with, he came out in an interview with Robin Roberts, who at the time was closeted herself, I felt that that interview should have gone to an openly gay journalist like me. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I talk about a little of this in the introduction to the book because it is not a biography. I do not think I'm that interesting. It is not. Now there are some biographical stories sort of sprinkled throughout, but really, what motivated me was that I came out relatively late, and I felt, at least to my parents, and I felt when I finally made that last big step. Um, that I owed the community something because I had been quiet for so long, and this opportunity came up, and I had been at the Baltimore Sun, I left there and did an internet startup, and I went to Verizon Wireless and did the first generation of apps, um, and I was just really unfulfilled and hated corporate America, and this opportunity with the Blade came up, and I thought, well, now that I'm fully out, what have I got to lose? I can be the loudmouth. I can stand up to Howard Dean and Martin O'Malley and all the right wing crazies, and I don't care. And so that was kind of what motivated me. I felt like I owed the community something. Um, and there at the time, you got to remember, 20 years ago, there was, Anderson Cooper wasn't out. We didn't have all of these openly gay media figures. We just didn't have them. That's a relatively new phenomenon. It's a great phenomenon, but we didn't have that back then. So, um, and I had plenty of people that I looked up to that inspired me too. But I just felt like I had nothing to lose by owning that and taking those arrows. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It was about 3 years prior. I, I think it speaks to the absolute power of the bully pulpit, and people underestimate it. But at the other end of that spectrum, when Donald Trump became president and used his bully pulpit to say that transgender people were banned from serving their country in any capacity, yeah, yeah, but the but the impact of that was immediate. So trans people were blocked from military service, and what we saw was an immediate uptick in hate crimes targeting the trans community, reflected in all of the FBI statistics immediately after that. The bully pulpit is real. So Obama used his bully pulpit to endorse marriage equality, and literally within hours of that interview, um, what happened was you had Republican senators, Rob Portman, you had rappers, actors, people from all walks of life suddenly tweeting their support for marriage equality because the president said it was okay. Well, I think he was evolving. I mean, he said, he took 4 years to get there, and he went against the advice of the LGBT advocacy groups who were telling him not to do it. And so I think, again, to his great credit, he did it. Um, Yeah, and it had a huge impact. And I don't think the Supreme Court would have done what they did in Obergefell if Obama had not done that 3 years earlier. Thank y'all.